I would like to commence by welcoming our audience and our speakers today. I would like to acknowledge the country on which I live and work, which is Wurundjeri and Bunurong nations. And I, in particular, would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Thank you for taking the time to join us to be at this special event. We are very pleased to be presenting the 29th lecture for you, Duldig lecture for you, especially those who are attending from countries other than Australia. This event builds on the Duldig studio tradition of inviting speakers to share knowledge about sculpture, sculpture collections, artists, museums, sculptural traditions, and how sculpture impacts us. I am delighted that we are able to welcome Dr. Arie Hartog and Dr. Gerhard Vaughan to be with us at this time. Arie joins us with the support of the Gordon Darling Foundation, and Gerard is a strong supporter of Duldig Studio and a major visual art identity in Australia and beyond. The format of this event will start with Gerhard Vaughan introducing the lecture and our guest speaker, Dr. Arie Hartog. Arie will then speak, and this will be followed by a brief Q&A session. Dr. Georgina Walker from the University of Melbourne, who is also joining us today, will help me with selecting questions that we can answer. Following this, there will be a formal conclusion to the event by the President of Duldig Studio, Anthony de Jong. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Gerhard Vaughan. Dr. Gerhard Vaughan was Director of the National Gallery of Australia from 2014 to 2018. A graduate of the Universities of Melbourne and Oxford, his career has divided between academia and the world of museums and galleries in both Australia and the United Kingdom. As an art historian, his interests are broad, concentrating on the social history of art and specialising in the study of taste and art collecting, both private and institutional. In 1994, he became inaugural director of the British Museum Development Trust in London, where he was closely involved in planning and funding the rebuild of the British Museum, with Norman Foster's Great Court at its centre. He returned to Melbourne in 1999 to become director of the National Gallery of Victoria, with a brief to oversee the gallery's complete redevelopment, also undertaking new programs for major exhibitions and collection development. After stepping down from the National Gallery of Victoria in 2012, Dr. Vaughan returned to academia for 2 years as the Jerry Higgins Professional Fellow at the Australian Institute of Art History at the University of Melbourne. It is now my great pleasure to hand to Gerard to introduce the lecture and our key speaker.
Well, thanks very much, Lyndel, and good evening. I should say perhaps guten Morgen, ladies and gentlemen. And it's both my pleasure and privilege to introduce the 2020 Duldig lecture, and in particular to introduce our distinguished lecturer, Dr. Ani Hartog, director of the Gerhard Marcks Haus in Bremen. This significant sculpture museum contains not only a highly important collection of the works of the modernist figurative sculptor, Gerhard Marcks, but also the work of many other 20th century and contemporary European sculptors. It's housed, and you may have seen some of the graphics, in a very handsome neoclassical building with modern extensions in close proximity to the Bremen Kunsthalle. And of course, it mounts regular survey exhibitions. Well, the annual Duldig lecture was inaugurated at the NGV, the National Gallery of Victoria, in 1986, which was the year of the death of Karl Duldig. And the inaugural lecture was given by my great friend and a predecessor as director of the NGV, Dr. Eric Westbrook. And since then, a truly impressive group of lecturers have contributed to the program. Just for a bit of background, the Duldig Studio was formally established in 1996 due to the vision and what I might describe as the amazingly energetic efforts of Eva de Jong Duldig, and of course, always supported by her late husband and someone we all miss very greatly, Henri de Jong, and the whole family. And they have created a truly significant venue within Melbourne's cultural landscape. It's always fascinated and impressed me because, as sometime director of what I suppose I can describe as the two largest art museums in Australia, I could always see the value of the Duldig studio experience, bringing visitors face to face with an eminent sculptor, experiencing his and his wife Slauer's own house and the studio, allowing visitors to see and understand the practice of these two artists. And of course, they were also very distinguished and effective art teachers, and that's a very important part of their life in Australia. But the Duldig studio offers more. It shines light on that great 20th century phenomenon which transformed the intellectual and cultural life of Melbourne and Australia. The arrival of refugees, especially Jewish refugees who had fled fascism and Nazism, looking for protection and a new start. And in doing so, of course, they enriched forever the cultural fabric of our nation. And in 2017, Eva published her inspiring and very fascinating family memoir, Driftwood, which sets out the story which the Duldig studio encapsulates. And of course, for me and for everybody who supports the Duldig studio, it's a great educational resource. And it's wonderful that so many school groups come to visit to understand the artist, the sculptor, Slauer's work too, and what that process of emigration meant in the mid-20th century. Now, our lecturer tonight, Dr. Arie Hartog, is the right person to offer us insights into the trajectory of modernist figurative sculpture in Germany and Europe before, during, and after the Nazi period. And Dr. Hartog is, in every sense, a polymath. Arie, I'm not going to go through your CV here or your bibliography, but it's very impressive, I have to say. And you've written very broadly on so many subjects. And I think that is a very important part of what you do. Now, of course, by definition, you are the great expert on Gerhard Marcks, but also you know and you work on the 20th century and contemporary practice in Germany and Europe, as I've said. It's worth noting perhaps that you're the chair of the German Association of Sculpture Museums and Sculpture Collections. Now, Arie was born and educated in the Netherlands, which is rather appropriate for the de Jong family links, of course. His interests are extensive. He's taught in universities, and they range from the history of sculpture in particular, to general art history, to architecture, to the idea of art for public places, and of course, museum studies. And he's also an expert in modern British sculpture, and those interests range from Henry Moore to, for example, Dame Elizabeth Frink. And when Arie speaks, you'll see one of Frink's very fine busts to the left of his figure. Now, Arie's subject tonight is truly fascinating. Having learnt about the sculptural practice of Karl Duldig, he's going to offer us an imaginary conversation between two men who never met, but who have both much in common and much that's different. One, a Jewish artist forced to flee Nazism and find a new life in Australia, and the other, a very distinguished modernist German artist who remained in Germany in difficult circumstances, who did his best, we know, to protect and support Jewish fellow artists, and who had what I think I can describe as the distinction of being denounced by the Nazis as a degenerate modernist, the whole Entartete Kunst issue, whose works were included, of course, in the notorious 1937 degenerate art exhibition in Munich. And as a result of that process, many of his works, in fact, were trashed and destroyed. Both were committed modernists who pursued different pathways and survived to make a real difference in the post-war period. Arnie's imagined meeting takes place, it's dated 1968. And ladies and gentlemen, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ani Hartog. Over to you, Ani.
Like I said, thank you, Gerhard, for your kind introduction, and thank you, Lyndel, Wischer, and Anthony de Jong for inviting me to this digital event. It is the first lecture in my life after just one cup of coffee, but I presume that flying to Melbourne and the jet lag that comes with it would have given me and you a similar experience. I'm speaking to you from the Gerhard Marcks Haus in Bremen, and our museum is closed due to well-known circumstances. We hold the bequest of Gerhard Marcks, but as a museum we show much more, all kinds of sculpture. At the moment we have a beautiful exhibition on the English artist Elizabeth Frink, the first on the European continent, and nobody's allowed to see it. Behind me you will see her Green Man from 1990. Green Man is a symbol for spring, rebirth, and the eternal cycle of life, and I felt it to be an appropriate background for a lecture under COVID-19 conditions. My original idea for this Duldig lecture, like I said, I was going to fly to Melbourne, was to tell you something about our museum in Germany, the way we look at art history, and if and how that relates to Karl Duldig. Also, as we have been working on Jewish sculptors in Europe for quite some time. And flying to Melbourne would have given me the chance to address what I saw in his sculpture. I've read the biography, Driftwood, but the work is what really made me curious. But while I did not have that opportunity yet, I've done quite some research into Duldig's first teacher, Anton Hanak, and Viennese sculpture in the 1920s and 30s. So having made that caveat, I nonetheless feel I can say something about this artist and his work. The next step, the future, will then be to start an actual conversation between our two museums to exchange information and knowledge, both in terms of content and approach. Because in the end, I feel it's very simple. There are only a few museums and scholars left dedicated to sculpture in the holistic sense of combining collecting, conservation, scholarly research, and education, and they should cooperate. As far as I know, Duldig and Marcks have never met. The German sculptor was 13 years older, and when Duldig started as an artist, Marcks already was a teacher at the Bauhaus in Weimar. And while Duldig followed an Austrian modernist path based on principles from around 1900, Marcks forged ideas about art education that would become important after the Second World War. Just talking about these two artists in this mode implies specific knowledge about their work, and in this lecture I will focus on the work and how to classify them. And as the positions are so contrasting, comparing makes their individual positions visible, or their profiles visible. The easy way would be, here you have a German, there an Austrian who became Australian. Focusing in, you might say, there's Berlin modernism, and there's Viennese modernism, but there's much more to be said. To put it bluntly, I will present some aspects of the diversity of sculpture in the German-speaking world before 1938 and its implications after 1945. But it's of course tentative to fantasize about a possible meeting. This is Runner Group from Gerhard Marcks from 1923. It is one of the few bronzes that came out of the Bauhaus. And this work used to be in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. But when it was deaccessioned last year, we were very, very lucky to obtain it for our collection. It was very likely inspired by Marcks' visit at a Maccabi sports event in Berlin, a prominent public sign of Jewish identity in the German capital. At that time, Duldig was the goalkeeper of the world-famous Viennese Jewish soccer team Hekoa, and we know that they traveled Europe and played in Berlin. Marx did like soccer, but most of all, he was interested in sports in the typical modernist sense, as a way to transcend traditional concepts of class and identity. That is something they could have talked about. So next to an art historical classification, we may have to consider the emancipation of the Jewish population after the end of both the Austro-Hungarian and the German Empire. Arts and sports played a big role in liberal Jewish communities, and while Duldig was active in these networks, Marx, himself a Protestant German, was largely dependent on Jewish collectors. They were the most important private sponsors for the development of modern art during the Weimar Republic. But the people sponsoring Marx and those sponsoring Duldig represent different social and political strata within German-speaking Jewish bourgeoisie. Those supporting Duldig supported a Jewish artist. Those supporting Marx showed their adherence to modern German culture by supporting a non-Jew. And the very moment you start to focus in on these sculptures, it may become very, very complex. But this focusing is what this simple operation is about. You see how different they are and how many fields there are to be taken into account. And the truth is, most of these fields have not been covered. It has a lot to do with exclusion and inclusion. Both sculptors work in what is called a modernist figurative way. On the surface, modern indicates that their work is not naturalist, but on a deeper level, modern means they do it for a market. These sculptors have their individual concept of art and present it to the world. And the fun part is how different they are. I guess that Duldig, seeing this sculpture by Marx, would have sighed, oh, a typical Berlin modernist, or something like no to Bauhaus. And Marx might have commented on Duldig, you know, I never liked Viennese sculpture. When you look at the figurative tradition from the outside, it all looks the same. They are figures. The very moment you look at the same tradition from within, you see differences. And we should remember that most art historical research, at least in Europe, looked at the figurative tradition from an ultra-modernist abstract viewpoint, accepting Auguste Rodin and Aristide Maillol as a starting point for abstraction, but not much more. In this lecture, I will suggest a second imaginary meeting somewhere in the late 1960s, shortly after Duldig retired. Marx was famous in both Europe and the US, and what had started as a very awkward conversation between Germans and Jewish emigres after the Second World War had become a little bit more natural by then. Marx had visited his former Jewish students in the US in 1963, and Duldig went to Europe in 1968, even contacting his former professor, Josef Müllner, who had been known to have National Socialist sympathies. Time heals no wounds, but I presume even they could have a friendly conversation on sculpture. While Marx and Duldig did not know each other, it is possible, even likely, that they noticed some famous works of the other. For example, Marx' Bremen town musicians, and Duldig's Akoa monument near Tel Aviv. And by the end of this lecture, I will have outlined some topics of that imaginary conversation, and I will have mentioned some categories to talk and think about in future research. But first, I will have to present you some key data and works to clarify Marcks' position. Most of you know Duldig, so here's the counterpart. Gerhard Marcks was born in Berlin in 1889. He lived until 1981, and in these 92 years, he produced more than 1,200 sculptures. So you'll just get a glimpse. He was a self-taught artist. On the recommendation of modern Berlin artists associated with the Berlin Secession, he decided against academy. They told him, if you want to become a modern artist, don't go to academy. The first human sculpture by him, Stehender Mann, Standing Man, from 1910, is a fine example of German early expressionism. At first sight, a simple standing man, but most viewers notice relatively quickly that there is something not quite right with him in the anatomical sense. His right leg, speaking from the man, has been extremely lengthened, and thus the artist achieves a series of parallel lines. There is no ponderation. Knees, hips, right arm, and shoulders form parallels, which is very much against nature and against early 20th century academic conventions. Here you see the lines. The idea is, of course, that while you do not see these orange lines in reality, you perceive the order. And that order, be it flat, as in this case, of parallel lines, or on a plane, or in a three-dimensional way, is in contradiction to life. So the artist seeks for a form to dissolve this paradox. That means that both aspects, nature and order, should be visible. And this will become the core idea of the German modern figurative tradition. In 1910, in a German context, it's radical. An interesting feature of the figure, it's about 45 centimeters high, something like this, is how it was produced. Marcks made a clay model, transferred it into plaster, and then had it cast in bronze. Business as usual, but the finishing work, which could normally be left to a foundry, he did himself. Even stronger, and you must travel to Bremen to see that, such precise finishing was hardly ever done in Germany around 1910. It was too expensive. The entire surface was hammered to create tiny dents that reflect the light. So the autodidact did not only want to know how to design a sculpture, but to understand all aspects of how to make it. So this figure from 1910 points to future developments at the Bauhaus. In 1919, Marcks is one of the first teachers at the Bauhaus in Weimar, this world-famous art school. He becomes the head of the pottery studio, and his position within the school and all conflicts about modern design are a topic for itself, but today I will concentrate on just his sculpture. Left you see his woman with baby, and on the right side the famous figure from Oskar Schlemmer from 2123. Schlemmer's form corresponds to the futuristic pathos of the Bauhaus as we know it today. Not just art and technology, but even man and technology presented as a new unity. And seeing the slide, it may occur to you that you have modernism to the right and some form of medieval-looking expressionism to the left. But the visual distance between Marcks and Schlemmer should not distract you from the agreement on a higher level. What Marcks did at the Bauhaus was what he called a laboratory of sculpture. while his colleagues continued to build on insights of the sculptural avant-garde, especially futurism in their work, Marcks did something different. He took a radical step forward and went back to the roots of sculpture. He wanted to experience all the principles from textbooks and tradition himself. That is, explore a craft from scratch. That's what his students should do in the workshop, and he tried it in his own medium. His central interest during his time at Bauhaus was what he called the basic sculptural form. The sculptor at this time defined his medium as an art of the interplay of mass and space, of cubes and cones, but he never took the step to pure abstraction. At first sight, the woman with baby looks like an expressionist work against the clean, robot-like aesthetics of Schlemmer. But using wood in 1919 was a necessity. Except for clay, there were no materials available until 1921. You all know how the painters at the Bauhaus were investigating the means of their media, form, line, and color. And Marcks does the same. Except for two lines in the hand of the woman and the arm of the baby, the complete sculpture is built out of convex, swelling forms. So, like the painters have color, the sculptors have volume as their means. In 1925, Bauhaus moves to Dessau and Marcks leaves for another school, Burg-Giebichenstein in Halle, where the principles of the early Bauhaus are being carried forward. He brings former students with him, among them Margriet Wildenhain, a Jewish woman who will teach pottery and ceramics in Halle. She was the model for this sculpture from 1930 that shows his development. While in the case of the standing man earlier, you could find parallel lines even on a photo. I could do the trick with the orange lines. It is impossible to do with this sculpture where the body parts, arms and legs are axes in space that form a triangular stereometric grid. You cannot show it on images, but let me give you another perspective. If you look at the left picture, you see the imaginary diagonal going from the foot to the head. The whole sculpture is built up along those imaginary composition lines. And by now, Marcks defined sculpture as the equilibrium of basic forms and nature. He tries to bring the two together. The idea is that a cube is a clear volume. You see a cube and you understand its spatial development. Nature has no clear forms, so it's the mission of the artist to find and develop these. The very moment you see the triangular composition of this sculpture, you understand its spatial layout. So it is figurative, but it is very much focused on questions we normally associate with abstract sculpture. With works like these, Marcks became well known in Germany around 1930. When MoMA in New York organized now famous exhibition of modern German art in 1931, Marcks was presented as the newest of the sculptors. It looks as if he was going to be the next big thing. And if in the early 1930s, Karl Duldig read the magazines at that time, he must have noticed his colleague rising to prominence. But let us pause and consider this apparent stylistic change. We've seen three phases, and for common art history, it looks as if Marcks started close to nature. Well, you now know he did not, became something like an expressionist, and then returned to nature. This development after expressionism is something that you see a lot in German art of the second half of the 1920s, and mostly it is regarded as a form of regression. And that is understandable from the perspective of high modernism, as expressionism can be interpreted as a step away from nature, but instead of becoming more abstract, Marx returns to nature. So, if you're looking for progress in art in the 20th century, you should not look at Marx. Or you must redefine your idea of progress. Remember, at the Bauhaus, he decided to start from point zero. So while art history sees progress between 1 and 2, he saw it between 2 and 3, and also between 1 and 3, as the composition was now truly dimensional and complex. For him, expressionism was a necessary phase to go through to see what sculptural forms work like. But expression is never the goal. Expression is one part of art, but order and what you see in nature are the others. And for Marx, it's all about the equilibrium, about moderation between the diverse aspects of sculpture. And what I have told you so far is the core of the narrative we have been constructing around Gerhard Marcks in our museum since 2009. The initial inspiration came from an exhibition on contemporary art in Maastricht, which is my birth town in the Netherlands. And it showed 5 unknown elder artists from the region, artists you would normally not expect in that highbrow kind of museum of contemporary art, and it had a very long title. If somebody keeps it up that long, there must be something good in it. Now, that is a very good starting point when you want to free yourself from both modernist myth and the fact that art history has become more and more market-driven in the last 20 years. It has dramatic consequences for curatorial practice, because our team is searching for that something good in it. And our museum is about presenting this. We tend to show mostly elder artists from very diverse backgrounds, and by that, by showing how very different they are, we make diversity visible. But back to Marx. Here you see 2 stone sculptures he made around 1932. The left one, Castalia, was prepared as a plaster and then transferred into Greek marble. The right one was worked into a much harder stone directly. For Castalia, left, Marx called in the help of a stonemason, as knowing how to do it does not mean that you have the skills or that you have all the skills. But the artist must prepare a form suitable for the material the work will be executed in. This is what you might call pragmatic truth to materials. The interesting thing about these sculptures in the context of German art in the early 1930s is that Marx is never using professional models. They are his friends and family, and it's of course intriguing then to read that journalists criticize the fact that the woman on the left has lumpy feet. Whereas Marx would argue sculpture is about finding an equilibrium between reality, whatever feet the woman has, and arranged clear forms. And while most of his colleagues at that time are specialists for themes, so be it supporting women, animals, or portraits, Marx does it all. And in the discussion of the early 1930s, he thereby states that finding a form is what sculpture is all about, and themes are secondary. He calls it the sculptural problem, and it must be dealt with in every single sculpture. He has a solo exhibition with the famous art dealer Alfred Flechtheim, but the political climate is already changing. He has become director of the school, of the art school in Halle, and after the National Socialists seize power in early 1933, his Jewish colleagues and friends are dismissed. He protests, and as a result, he himself is sacked. So in 1933, the career of a German artist seemed to end, but it's much more complicated. On the one hand, he is seen as a degenerate artist from the official side, but on the other hand, he is an established artist with a network of clients who still support him in Germany, and until 1941, Jewish emigres that went to the US. Typical of Marx is this sculpture, Johannes, from 1936. It is his reaction to the model of masculinity that was propagated in both fascist Italy and Germany. The hips are wider than the shoulders, and those of you familiar with classical iconography may see from the movement of the hands that it is a hyacinth, Apollo's lover, a boy holding a flower, so definitely a man useless in warfare, as the Nazis saw quite clearly. This is one of the sculptures. It is, on first sight, a traditional figurative sculpture, but it was one of the sculptures that he was forbidden to exhibit during the Third Reich. So the strange situation is that you have a famous German sculptor working in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, but always in a distance to official cultural politics. And that is also the explanation for why Marx became the foremost sculptor for war memorials after 1945. He was the only one of the elder sculptors from the 1920s and 30s still alive. Ernst Barlach had died in 1938, who had not worked for or with the Nazis. Marx designs a great amount of war memorials, and most well known at the time, the monument in Hamburg from 1952. This is when you are standing in front of the entrance and then you come in. The monument reverts to the Greek mythological story of Vaughan, the ferryman bringing the death over Styx, and by this referral to antiquity, he makes a political point about monuments in the years after the Second World War. Most war memorials try to make sense of what has happened or interpret it from a Christian perspective, and instead of that, Marx makes a group of monuments with one clear message: people are dead and there is no sense at all in this. His monuments share a pessimistic worldview fueled by experience. At the same time, Marx becomes a popular modern artist. He works as a graphic artist, mostly woodcuts, and as a sculptor. And by this, he supplies post-war German society with art, mostly because his works are available to very different people, from those saving for a woodcut to those who could easily afford a portrait or a large-scale sculpture. Especially his animal sculptures draw a lot of positive attention from a large audience, while on the other hand, younger museum people and art critics dislike his figurative work. His most popular sculpture is, of course, the Bremen town musicians. You saw in the beginning, but in the second half of the 1960s, his popularity is waning. And what you then see is that Marx is starting to think about what has happened in my work and what do other artists do. The interesting thing is also that until the mid-1960s, he was always very unfriendly in discussions and always like, my position is the best. In the second half of the 1960s, he started to become more and more tolerant. So what follows now is the outline of an imaginary conversation. I presume that Duldig and Marcks would have started with memories from Berlin. Like I showed you at the beginning, the Maccabi sports event, and then went to sculptors, both new. Gerhard Marcks would have been amazed to hear that Duldig learned with Anton Hanak and Josef Müllner in Vienna. For those two were also the teacher of what he has always called the worst sculptor ever, Josef Thorak, one of the two central artists of the Third Reich. And having acknowledged that, Karl Duldig would have explained, first of all, how diverse Hanak's class had become. He would have remembered Marcks that not only he himself and Thorak, two very different sculptors, but also the famous Austrian sculptor Fritz Wotruba came out of the same background. And then the conversation could have switched to the meaning of craft and teaching. They would have agreed on the teacher as an example. The teacher shows that it's important to work, but he does not show what you have to do. And they would have agreed on the fact that every pupil, every student should develop his or her own sculptural language. But Marcks would have asked with more than just a little irony, would Karl Duldig as a teacher have accepted somebody like Thorak? And Duldig answers no. And would start about the relationship between contours and materials, and how Hanak's sculpture to the left was deeply indebted to ideas that were prominent in dance around 1900. Feelings are transmitted through the posture of the body. And of course, Duldig would add, Thorak is just bad. Look at the pedestal and how the movement of the hands and the head have no links to the rest of the body, or the bodies, whereas Hanak has found a spatial composition with elbow and knee protruding into space. Correct, Marcks would answer, but the contour is the problem. All these small concave and convex forms, they add up to a sculpture that confuses lively contours with small pats of fat or muscles. And while in Hanak, you still have the impression of a block and weight, even on a photograph, in Thorak, all sculptural logic is lost. So for the sake of our eyes, let's change the subject. I presume that Duldig must have had that discussion over and over, and it's meaningful that while he adopted Hanak's truth to material ideology, he never took on the wobbly, fleshy contours. I'm quite sure that Marcks would have liked The Kneeling Woman from 1924, and he would have remarked about the thick legs and the thick neck that indicate that this sculpture was made for a frontal and not for the side view. Tidy act, or direct carving, forces the sculptor to take the sides of a block as a starting point, and while there are forms thinkable where this could apply, think of the stone sculpture by Marcks, Psyche, you saw earlier, Marcks was very critical about fundamentalist truth to materials, as it limits sculpture in its principal goal, forms its space. But Marcks and Duldig would have agreed very strongly on the fact that students must learn a craft. And Marcks would have acknowledged that some Viennese thinking that Duldig had learned was also at the basis of the Bauhaus. But when you make a terracotta, Marx would say you should not start with clay. Think about the form first. And if you need a plaster to prepare a better form for that material, you should use it. And he might have referred to his figures for Lübeck, where he completed the series of figures by Barlach on the facade of St. Catherine's. Yes, Duldig knew that clay has a certain weakness, but that in itself is an aesthetic quality. Duldig worked with exactly that quality, and that is what made me so curious to see the works in reality. And Marx, in imaginary conversation, would probably have said, you know, I was something like an expressionist for a year or 3. You became one in Australia. Your work is about expressing material and feeling, not my cup of tea, but consistent and relevant. So the conversation would have confirmed Duldig in his position, which is why I can show you one of his works after the proposed imaginary meeting. And then, at one point or another, the discussion would have come to Joseph Müllner, who was very well known in this generation for heroic classicism. And Gerhard Marcks would have understood by now very clearly that working in wood and clay and letting the material lead the way was not just a way to make your work look modern, but most of all, a rebellion against the consequences of the Viennese academic tradition and its heroism. Stone implies heroism, clay does not. While Jewish sculptors during the interbellum had tried to work in the same modes their German and Austrian colleagues worked in, a Jewish sculptor after the war had reasons to defer. And Marx knew and understood that Müllner's most famous sculpture in Vienna, it's still in the center of the city, was a monument to German, Austrian, non-Jew sportsmen who had died in the First World War. So he got the picture. Marx would be, I think, excited to see Duldig's Hakoah monument, a monument for Jewish sportsmen who died in the Holocaust. He'd be torn between dislike and admiration. He didn't like big gestures outside of contour. In his work, the arms are mostly close to the body, but except the man we saw in the beginning is an exception. But this monument needed to be appellative. On the other hand, it should not be classicist by any means. The strange proportions lift the man out of any reference to nature. And knowing how naturalism can become heroic and how he himself fought that trap, think of Johannes, the boy with the small shoulders, Marx would have understood this visual language. He had told his students to be careful when using gestures. It could mean something and distract from the composition, but that was exactly what Duldig's work was all about. It wants to speak not indirectly and silent like Marx monuments, but in your face. Ladies and gentlemen, this imaginary conversation I have sketched is an important strategy to get away from reducing artists to the stories of their life. Looking for if somebody keeps it up that long, there must be something good in it. It means you go searching for visual language and artistic strategies, and contrasting positions may help defining those. In the case of Duldig, his visual language may have related to developments in Australia, of which I have no real knowledge, or to the history of sculpture in the German-speaking world, which is my field. This imaginary conversation hints, and that is my conclusion, that this could be a fruitful path for further research. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I think the information and the visual information you just shared has stimulated us a lot, and there's a lot to take in terms of what you have said. There's actually a lot to absorb. So my question sounds like it's going to a very simplistic aspect, but it's something that struck me early in your slides was the male nude, and you mentioned that I think Marcks beat the bronze to allow light to play differently on the surface. And something I can share with you, which you would have noticed should you have come to Australia, and we do hope that you can do that next year, as we have talked about, is that Karl Duldig did this primarily with, or he did it later in life as he worked with terracotta. So interestingly, that final piece, and you showed Echo to the right by Karl Duldig, when he's sculpting like that at that scale, he is gradually, he is hand building that work. And when he does it, we see even the impressions of the artist's fingerprints in the clay, and we see that he builds it up piece by piece. It's a very, it's actually one mode of hand building in clay that I have seen by different artists, including Karl. The thing that's extraordinary is the scale to which he can build the work. The other thing that is lovely when you see it is that light plays off that work in a very interesting way. And I just thought that is a nice one observation I have about a visual connection between each artist's work. And I wonder, did Marcks keep doing this? Did he keep sort of adapting the surface of his work in order to deal with light, or did he start to let the medium do the talking?
Well, the thing is, there is one important difference between what Marcks did and what you were describing of Duldig. That is that Marcks does it on a bronze. The bronze sculpture is being cast, it's polished, it's ready, and then he starts to hammer it. And the very moment you do that on metal, the metal gets pushed, and the metal gets a very kind of, very typical kind of quality, which you would normally see in 16th, 17th century sculpture, and not so much in sculpture of the 20th century. And the interesting thing is that Marcks is doing that just in that one sculpture. It's like, I want to know what it means. It takes me half a year, but nonetheless, I'm going to do it. And then afterwards, he uses all kinds of other strategies. And he is also, he's not so interested in this very diverse play of light anymore. He's much more interested into clear forms. I mean, if you see Frink here behind me, she's also very much interested in diverse light on the sculpture. For Marcks, that played no too big role after that early sculpture.
Thank you, Arie. I have a question here from Anthony de Jong. Where is Marcks represented in collections outside of Germany?
The Marcks, the most holdings outside of Germany are in the United States. They are on the one hand from collectors who went to the United States in the 1930s and took their works with them. So a lot of early works are actually in United States private collections, and then between 1945 and about 1960, there are a lot of museums in the United States who are also collecting his work. And there's of course one famous work of him in Australia, the core. But there's quite a lot in also in Swiss collection, but mostly in the German-speaking world.
Yes, thank you, Arie. Yes, for the Australian audience members, the Art Gallery of Western Australia has cited the work called in English, The Crier, which is a very distinctive piece. It is prompting me to go back to Western Australia to look at that when I can next do that. We have in our audience, Arie, Dr. Jane Eckert, and I want to acknowledge Jane. She has a question for you, but before I pass that on, I would like to thank Jane. It is Jane who actually put your name forward, Arie, to be our guest lecturer. So my conversation with you, as you know, commenced. Dr. Jane Eckert provided last year's Duldig lecture, and she has written some excellent work on many sculptors, including some of our modernist 20th century Australian artists. She, in her comments, says, "Thank you, Arie, for such a provocative and thoughtful imaginary discussion. I'm curious about the hypothetical date, 1968, and why you chose this date. We're used to thinking that figuration was, well, I guess there's probably two things here, a question about 1968 and some commentary. We're used to thinking that figuration was largely bypassed and discredited by then, yet senior artists were still developing their own vision of the sculpted figure. Could you please say something about how Marcks viewed his own position in 1968?
Yes. First of all, the reason I took 1968 is because the Haus monument, which you saw, was very present in German media. I am quite sure that he must have seen that. I cannot, I cannot prove it, but this is a kind of work that was quite well known. Also, of course, because of the fact that the Haus soccer team was a German-speaking team. So therefore, I think that Duldig's monument, Marcks may have seen it. The other thing is that they would both be in the position of not being teachers anymore, and in this kind of a distance. How did you work as a teacher? And that would make the conversation much better, instead of, I have a very good student, you should help him, the way normally such a conversation would go. And then to the figurative position. On the one hand, we have this story of high modernism. And in the 1960s, of course, abstraction in its original form is already passé. We are talking about diverse forms of minimalist and site-specific sculpture. But on the other hand, there is still a figurative tradition. And for example, in Germany, it's quite strong. There is, in the 1960s, something like a renaissance going on. And that renaissance, and that links it to the year 1968, also has political implications, because the left in Germany in the late 1960s says, well, the point is, most art that is being promoted by museums and specialists is not an art for a broad audience, whereas figurative art still has that, you know, the ability to speak to a very large audience. And in the case of Marx, he was conservative, he was absolutely not by any means left-wing. We know that he took some form of self-confidence from that, like saying, well, you see, I'm not dead. I'm still doing this, and there are still people who like this and think it's important. And that is an interesting thing. When we are talking about developments in art history, we must not forget that some artists may at some point become passé, but they're still working. They're still going on. So the whole idea of stylistic change may not mean so much, may not say so much about actual stylistic change, but more about, say, the preferences of a society for one aesthetic or another. But this would be a very intriguing, very long second lecture.
Indeed. Well, Arie, I think you could have probably a very long conversation with Jane, probably at a convenient time, and I hope our borders all open up internationally. I do have another question here I'm going to share from an audience member, Ani Hartog. His question is, well, firstly, he says, thank you, Arie, for connecting so many dots for us. Very interesting lecture from what you know of Duldig's work. Are there any dots to be connected between the Bauhaus movement and Karl Duldig's work, apart from the link with Marx? And more generally, any known dot connections between the Bauhaus movement and Australian art?
Well, first of all, there is of course a link over some emigres who came to Australia, but there is also on an earlier level this kind of connection, and that was what I hinted at one point. That is that in the late 19th century in Vienna, in the surroundings of the Arts Academy, people start thinking about the fact that design is not enough. You must know and understand a craft, which is a very important kind of position in the late 19th century. It develops among sculptors. Most known is Edmund Helmer, the teacher of Haag, and Haag is the guy who is taking that into practice. And the Berlin artists in surrounding of Walter Gropius, they knew that. They knew that in Vienna, people had a complete new idea about crafts and about the relationship between, on the one hand, craft and skills, and on the other hand, art and design. So when the Bauhaus was funded, the revolutionary thing about the Bauhaus from a German perspective, that is from a bureaucratic German educational perspective, was that it was a combination of a crafts school and an arts academy. And that was something that you can bring back to also Viennese influences.
Thank you. So, Arie, we're going to take one more question, and then we're going to hand to Anthony to do our acknowledgements and thank yous. I do have a question from one of our curatorial support workers here, Melinda Mockridge. She is interested in your observation about the choice of material, I think, by Karl. She asked the question, do you think perhaps he chose clay as a rejection of all that stone and possibly bronze represented in terms of tradition, and that this had an ideological element to it, as well as practical.
My suggestion is very clearly that it is. I think that the working in clay and working with this material against, because the forms you make in clay will never have that kind of pushy spatial quality a stone or a bronze can have. And Duldig, being a really skilled sculptor, knew that. So the conclusion must be he did not want that. He used clay, including the weakness of that material, to give it a certain kind of expression. And that expression is one of the things that people then also relate to, because clay speaks to people much more directly than bronze or stone, which are much more, you know, the materials of power. And I think that for it would be an interesting thing. I've started to look at diverse Jewish emigre sculptors after 1945, and a lot of them started working in clay and using all those qualities of clay that academic sculptors disliked about it. So that is an interesting field to dig into, and I'm quite sure that as you have so much material over there, you're going to find very intriguing things.
Indeed, and it reminds me, some of your answer reminds me of the fact that you did mention, I think I had this correctly, that Marcks at one point made woodcuts. So in other words, a form of printing, am I right, Arie?
Yes, yes.
Yes, so I think my sense there is, I found that very interesting, and I think I do know Karl Duldig did also at one point in his career in Australia make what we call wheel-thrown work, decorative ware that was sold. It has a folkloric quality, much like woodcuts on works on paper. So I think there again is another connection between the artists, what they did when they were not sculpting or working in stone, or when they were not seeking to cast their work in bronze. So what I think we should do, because we are getting to the time where we have now heard your wonderful lecture and given people a chance to comment and ask questions, and I thank everyone for that. And thank you, Arie, for your responses to those questions. Arie, I cannot thank you enough, and Anthony will also make a formal thank you.
So the first person that I'd like to thank is our prime speaker, Dr. Arie Hartog. Thank you very much, Arie, for your excellent and thought-provoking presentation. I noticed a number of parallels as you relayed some of the story of Gerhard Marcks and the work that he'd produced with Karl Duldig, which I just thought I'd just dwell on for a moment in referring to your lecture. The first one, I think, was that both were such prolific and enduring sculptors over their whole lifetimes, despite their change in circumstances and the changing climates and countries that they were in. The reality is that they endured as sculptors throughout their life. And the other comment you made that sort of caught my attention was the comment about Gerhard Marcks finishing his own bronzes, which is also something that Karl Duldig did, and the fact that both really understood the end-to-end process of sculpting and sculptures, and the focus on form that they both had in adhering to the fundamental truth to materials. I think that was another comment you made, which I thought really highlighted the parallels in their lives. It would have been wonderful to have had that imaginary conversation somehow come real and be recorded in 1968, a very important year for Karl Duldig, and also no doubt a time in Germany when a conversation would have been very thought-provoking and interesting. So thank you for your presentation. I hope that we're able to visit Bremen at some point in the future, I'd like to visit the museum there, and I'm sure we'd like to welcome you in Australia once travel becomes possible again in the future. I'd also like to thank Dr. Gerhard Vaughan for his insightful introduction to our lecture this year. His continued support for the Duldig Studio over the past 2 decades has been invaluable, commencing with his period as director of the National Gallery of Victoria, where the lecture was held for many years and where we did have a number of international speakers while it was paired with the Melbourne Winter Masterpieces series, and they're listed in the program of speakers. The work that he did there was in conjunction with our now Vice President of the Duldig Studio, Gina Panabianco, who formerly had a role in leading public programs with the National Gallery of Victoria and working with Eva de Jong Duldig in presenting some very successful lectures over the years. The lecture on sculpture, the Duldig lecture on sculpture, is now in its 34th year. It's, as far as we know, the only annual lecture on sculpture in Australia, and in that alone it is very significant. We're delighted that Gerard, you're able to join us in this webinar format, and that we're able to make it possible for people not just in Melbourne or physically in Melbourne at the NGV or the University of Melbourne, where we've also presented the lecture, but also regional Victorians and national and international audiences to participate and also to view the webinar afterwards. So that's a big step forward. I'd like to thank the University of Melbourne for their partnership in presenting the lecture. In particular, our newest board member, Dr. Georgina Walker, has been very central in the planning and the activity related to the lecture. And I'd like to thank Georgina, who's a fellow in the Faculty of Arts and School of Culture and Communication, for her contribution to this event. We hope to be back in presentations with the University of Melbourne in 2021 and beyond. I'd also like to thank our sponsors. We've had support from the Gordon Darling Foundation to assist the museum as part of their gallery and museum industry initiatives across Australia, and their support of the annual lecture on sculpture and future planned symposium are to be acknowledged, and we're looking forward to that taking place once we're able to get back up and running in a more physical way in Australia. I'd also like to call out and thank Lyndel Wischer, our director. Lyndel is the mastermind behind this program. It is a prelude to an exhibition on Karl Duldig called Living Legacy, which will be open to the public on the 2nd of February 2021. And unlike the Australian Open Tennis, we do not propose to delay the opening any further. I want to acknowledge the generous support of the City of Stonington in relation to that exhibition, and look forward to welcoming as many of you as possible to view the exhibition online, and even more importantly on site when we reopen in the new year. It's quite frustrating, as you heard Arie say, when you have a great new exhibition, but unfortunately the COVID conditions make it difficult to attend. And I empathise with the position that the Gerhard Marcks House has at the moment with their own exhibition. I'd also like to thank the rest of the team behind this year's lecture and webinar event. These things don't come without a lot of work behind the scenes, and in particular, I'd like to thank Stefan Damsky, our curator, Lucy Whitehill, who's assisted us with marketing, Gina Panabianco, Georgina Walker, and Janine Kibblewhite, our board members who've participated in setting up and operating the event. My next person to thank is incredibly important to us and remains the driving force as the founder and patron of the studio. That's Eva de Jong Duldig. It's very important to see her continue to bring energy and passion to the studio, and in bringing the art of Karl Duldig and the story of the Duldig family to the wider community. And we thank her for her participation and ongoing support and drive. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you. In particular, I'd like to thank those attendees who've kindly donated to the Duldig Studio as part of their registering for this event. It is a free event, but for those of you that are interested in supporting the studio, please look at our Support Us page on our website at duldig.org.au. The address here at the bottom, we do have a Support Us page, and you can get involved and support us in a number of different ways. And I'd also like to thank everyone who's attended this evening. Your participation, your insightful questions are integral to the purpose and continuation of this annual lecture series, and in acknowledging the important role that sculpture plays in the culture and lives of communities across the globe. With that, I'll thank you again all for your participation, and we will be winding up this event.